Hello, everybody, and thank you guys so much for being flexible with last week. Childcare is just such an interesting and ever-changing issue right now in my life. So thank you, and I'm really happy to be here as usual. So today we're going to talk about kind of one of the more kind of higher level issues in language access that I get asked about a lot, which is, data evaluation and collection in order to do sort of continual improvement and to evaluate how successful your programs are with language access. So I do have some slides today. They're pretty simple, and I encourage you, as always, to please use the chat feature to ask questions. I'll try to keep it, right within the hour, but I'll make sure that we have some time at the end for discussion and, just sharing what's worked, what's not worked for you all. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Anthony, are you able to give me the ability to do that?
That might help, huh?
It's okay.
There you go. Give it a shot now. It should work.
Great. Perfect. Thank you. Okay. Go ahead and start this here. So, basically what I want to do today is to kind of give you guys some tools and information, as always, that can help you to kind of develop ways to assess not just the needs of your communities, but in this case, more your own needs, and to evaluate the effectiveness of all of your efforts when it comes to language accessibility. So we're going to kind of talk about the differences between evaluation and assessment. And just share some tools that you can use to just continually improve and monitor your language access efforts, using assessment and evaluation. And so since this topic is, I think, a little bit intimidating for some people, I'm also going to share examples and resources and information about these topics. I actually just emailed them to Anthony for you. Anthony, you should have those in your inbox, and you can share them with participants who are interested. There are, data collection toolkits and a really nice, concise PowerPoint about data collection and evaluation. There's some information about assessment versus evaluation, and some tools and frameworks to actually do assessment and evaluation that I think are really helpful. So I hope that those can be helpful to you also. So Anthony can just sort of share those with you after today's presentation if you want. And like I said, please use the chat feature, speak up. I'm really excited to talk about this topic, and I think, as always, your input is going to be really valuable. So I wanted to take a minute before we start to just kind of engage you guys, and I wanted to ask you to think about and share with the group, when you think about language access, what is the intention of your strategy, right? What's the point? What's the actual intent? Not just we want to do language access better, not just we want people to be included, or we want people to have a voice, or we want to provide equitable access to services, right? Because that's very broad. You want to needle down and you want to think about, what is the intent of your language access strategy? And that can be usually specific to kind of specific problems. So, an example would be like, if your city is about to change like 15 bus stops, for example, and people who don't speak English, who live in the communities that are affected by those changes, don't know that you're about to change 15 bus stops, right? A target answer to the intent of your language access programming in that context might be, to effectively notify residents who are going to be affected by this change. And like, once you've defined those specific goals, you can think about how to measure whether or not you were successful after you've executed a plan, right? And if not, what you can do differently for the future. Or if you were successful, what did you do well that you could do again, right? And so when you look at language access, I think everybody on this call has a vested interest in doing it because we care deeply about the communities that we serve. And you're not just doing it to check a box, right? But even beyond that, it's really helpful to think about clear and specific goals. And another question would be, which communities are you trying to engage, right? Which language groups live on those bus routes? And so I wanted to ask you guys before we start, what are some of your intents? What are some of the reasons that you guys are doing language access, right? It can be anything, right? It could be because maybe your police department got sued, right? Or I mean, that's kind of grim, but maybe you want to increase enrollment of LEP individuals in specific programs, right? So I'm really curious to hear what you guys have in common and, excuse me, why you're doing this. And the reason I want to ask you to say it out loud is to help you define your goals, right? And to have you start thinking about those goals. So why don't you guys go ahead and just share with me some of your reasons? Oops, sorry.
Hi, Mary Jane. This is Farhat Popel in San Diego. I think one reason that we've been talking a lot about here is really to improve access to public meetings, increase civic engagement, and really make sure that our 1 in 4 foreign-born residents has a voice in policymaking. It's so difficult to promote that when the fundamental barrier of language access exists, and I feel like we need to do better.
That's great. Yeah, those are 3 very specific goals, right? To increase participation, to increase input that people who don't speak English have in the formation of policy, right? And to let people know that these meetings are happening, right? Like those are 3 super clearly measurable goals, and I think that's great. So what about some of the rest of you? Or even if you haven't defined them, what do you guys think some examples could be?
Mary Jane, this is Niken from Erie, and I think
Hey,
the purpose we do here is for our residents to have an easy access to the city services.
okay, great. Access to services. So that's a good example, and I'm glad you said it, because that's a good example of a broad goal, right? You have to kind of say, to increase participation in, the free or reduced lunch program. That's just kind of an example among your LEP population, right? Because then you can kind of measure that effectively, right? Because if you say city services as a whole, the business of evaluating and measuring and tracking whether or not you're successful becomes a lot more difficult, right? And it's not just about measuring being difficult. It's really at the end of the day, the fact that without clear goals, you're less likely to be effective, right? And so I'm really glad you guys both gave me kind of on both sides of the spectrum there. And Ken, that's not to say that your goals are wrong or bad in any way, just to help you think about ways you can be more effective, right? And asking yourselves these questions can help you define your goals, right? So I think it's really easy for a language access plan or language access policies to just be sort of labeled as their own nebulous goals in and of themselves, right? To achieve language access or to increase access to services, right? But what does that actually look like? In what ways will language access solve specific relevant problems, right? Why are you doing this and for whom? So achieving goals continually and successfully really can't happen without answering these questions and without building strategies around these specific goals. And so if you start sort of trying to solve problems without really understanding the problems on kind of a more granular level, and who your target audience is, what their needs are, what you need within your own department in order to achieve these things, you're not going to get very far, right? And so you need a plan. And a lot of people will consider the language access plan to be the plan, but a big part of that language access plan is this evaluation piece, right? And so I like to think of the language access plan as kind of like a broad, guiding set of policies, procedures, and ideas that can be applied to specific problems, right? And solving those specific problems is something for which you're going to need data, and something for which year after year you will be able to do better once you have that data and a way to track it. So this is going to be your evaluation strategy, right? And your evaluation strategy is what's going to help you successfully measure the impact of your programs. So measuring impact is kind of the big thing here, right? And anybody who's ever dealt with a foundation or tried to get funding for something that might be a little bit non-traditional or for which there's not a lot of framework or infrastructure understands that, you know, they're always asking you like, well, what are your outputs and how do you measure those? And, you know, it's just such an important stage of understanding whether your strategies are feasible, and after the fact, whether your strategies worked or whether your objectives were met, right? And so this is kind of where you work out what went well and what didn't, so that you can learn, improve, replicate, you know, et cetera. And so another example might be if your goal was to get 100 people to show up for a community event, right? You know, maybe some kind of a town hall or something like that, but you fell short of that 100-person mark, well, then you need to evaluate your plan and evaluate what you did to see what it is that you could have done better or differently, right? Maybe you could have tried, you know, reaching out to more people or used a multi-channel approach, or, you know, to get even more relevant, maybe your translator used an informal tone to reach a formal audience, or maybe there were literacy concerns that weren't flagged, or maybe a volunteer translator who's untrained translated something literally rather than you know, rendering the meaning correctly, right? So how can you ensure that doesn't happen again in the future? And the key is just to kind of have solid measurable parameters for every aspect of your programming whenever you're trying to accomplish certain things. So an example of what that could look like might be that like you ensure that you evaluate your outreach strategy on a regular basis, you know, just to make sure you're meeting those goals. And I'm going to talk a bit now about the difference between assessment and evaluation in the context of language access, and then, you know, maybe try to think of if you have questions and hold them till the end. But please do ask if you do have questions, because this stuff is a little heady. And I know that you guys are all policy folks and government folks, and so you obviously have a lot of experience with, you know, evaluation and assessment. But I think it's really worthwhile to have these like reminder conversations, especially in the context of language access. So assessment and evaluation are two distinct concepts that are really easy to conflate, I think. In the programmatic context, right? And just to be clear, like, so we're not talking about community needs assessment. We're talking about the assessment of your own activities. So in the programmatic context, assessment is the process of collecting, reviewing, and using data for the purpose of improving performance, right? And then evaluation can be defined as kind of what you do in order to be able to evaluate, right? Or rather, evaluation is described as, or assessment is that process of collecting, reviewing, etc. Evaluation is described as the act of passing judgment on the basis of a set of standards or metrics. Sorry, I kind of messed that part up there. My notes were a little bit crooked. But whichever way you look at it, assessment is basically what you need to do in order to be able to evaluate, right? And assessment provides kind of like an objective view of performance and areas of improvement, and it's very process oriented. It's, you know, based on observation and data collection. And in contrast, evaluation really determines kind of the extent to which your goals have been achieved or are achieved. And it's based more on the standards for quality that you set. It's more product oriented and goal oriented, results oriented, and its function is to report, right? To report results. The purposes of assessment and evaluation are really to continually improve, to build and maintain data sets. I think a lot of people undersell how valuable it is to build and own data and to keep track of your data, to define your funding sources, right? And to inform your action using data and observation, right? So that you're not wasting resources and you're being effective, right? You know, this can be, you know, data and observation about things like, you know, which languages are in a certain geographical area, you know, how to target those areas. If a community is like 80% Spanish speaking and 20% Vietnamese speaking, and your language access plans, we need to do the top 6 languages, then you're wasting resources there, right? And so using data and observation to make appropriate decisions is a big reason to do assessment and evaluation. And while it feels like it's really kind of a complex task to build these frameworks and to collect the data, I mean, I know it's hard to get people to share their data with you, right, and to collect it. But once you have that process in place, it's so much less work than, you know, in that last example, continually providing services in 6 languages when really only 2 are needed, right? Or to continue to do programming and to spend money and to spend time where there are these huge inefficiencies that can be avoided using data. Sorry, I advanced again, but you know, both assessment and evaluation will help improve that kind of effectiveness and the sustainability, the efficiency, and to kind of continually improve your programming. Data collection and analysis, the storage and storytelling that can be implemented through these processes can also kind of increase access to funding, that can improve buy-in from leadership for your programming. And a quick note about that is that if you can assess the needs of your communities and tell a compelling story about it in the near future, you can probably galvanize enough support to inform the 2022 budget, which, you know, is something to consider. But at any rate, for the purposes of language access planning with assessment, the main assessments you're going to want to perform are, you know, assessments of the problem, right? So community needs usually, and an assessment of your own programming and resources, the resources you have to do that programming. So we talked about community needs assessment as part of outreach and engagement in a previous workshop. And during this portion of today's workshop, we're going to kind of talk about assessing that work. So for community needs assessments, the Centers for Disease Control has a really handy needs assessment workbook that I included in that resource packet that I sent to Anthony. It's really good. And then the CDC has another great tool called the Community Health Assessment and Group Evaluation Tool, or the CHANGE tool as the acronym, that can kind of help you create action plans based on the information that you collect when you do community needs assessments. That's also in the resource packet. But if for some reason, like I, you know, missed a link or did it incorrectly, you're welcome to reach out to me and I'll share that with you. Assessing your program is kind of the other side of that assessment coin, right? When I talk about first, you know, assessing community needs and problems, the other side of that is assessing your own capacity to solve those problems, the resources that you have, what you may need, what's lacking, etc. So, you know, we'll talk about that a little bit now. And I would say that assessing your program, assessing your program is, you know, kind of one of those things that we talk about a lot, but doesn't get executed very often. And I think most of the very successful language access plans that I've seen do regularly assess their progress toward goals and their own internal resources, you know, what their needs are, you know, what kind of tools they have, who their personnel are that are working on certain problems, et cetera. And this kind of assessment is, I say, particularly important for the success of a language access program because it can inform, you know, decisions about how you allocate your resources. It can inform decisions about, you know, program improvements. It can, you know, inform decisions about impact. And there are kind of 3 broad steps that are generally considered the gold standard for measuring the progress of your program. That's deciding what to measure, collecting data on those measures, and then executing those measures, right? And so we'll start with deciding what to measure. And that's kind of the most important decision that you can make, right? Deciding what you're actually going to measure. In general, measures fall into three categories, right? When we start to talk about programmatic assessment: inputs, outputs, and outcomes. And I'm sure a lot of you have heard these terms or regularly use these terms in your own work, but bear with me if I'm sort of over explaining something that you guys already have a lot of experience with. But inputs are the things that go into making your program work, right? Money, staff, technology, contractors, volunteers, et cetera, et cetera. Outputs are the things that are directly produced by your program, right? Such as number of documents translated, number of interpreters booked, number of workshops that had LEP persons in attendance, et cetera, et cetera. And then outcomes are the results of those outputs, right? So for example, increased involvement or participation by LEP constituents, decreased complaints by LEP constituents, right? Those are kind of like measurable outcomes that are, that result directly from the outputs that you create using the inputs that you put into the program. Inputs are usually the easiest to measure, right? It's kind of simple to count how many bilingual staff you have or how many staff are dedicated to managing your language access program. But that data might not convey information that's as meaningful about a program's progress or success, right? So in other words, like having resources doesn't necessarily lead to significant service delivery, or having resources doesn't always lead to success, right? Outputs are the most direct measure since they're what your program actually produces, but doing more doesn't always translate to reaching goals, right? So for example, an increase in the number of documents translated or the more frequent usage of interpreters doesn't necessarily provide information about the quality or impact of your language access program, right? Measuring outcomes gets at those goals, right? Because a number of different factors influence outcomes outside of the control of your program. So outcome measures might not only reflect your program's effectiveness, but also, external factors. So choosing what to measure from within each of these kind of indicator categories will kind of paint the broadest picture of what's happening on the ground and eventually kind of improve your abilities to do that with more efficiency and greater skill. So in order, once you've decided kind of what data you want to collect, you kind of have to figure out how to collect that data, right? And so after you've figured it out, you have to design a process for collecting the actual data. And there are kind of two aspects to collecting data on your measures. And I would say that those are how to measure them and how often you measure them, right? The how depends on the metric itself. Some data might come from existing databases, right, such as the Census Bureau or information that school districts have about enrollment. Hours of staff time may have already gone into collected in being collected in like a human resource database. Budgetary expenditures are probably already tracked by a budget analyst. Participation in other activities might be collected on sign-in sheets, right? So how you collect things depends on what it is, and all of that existing information is a really valuable and robust source. But other measures might require you to create data collection systems, right? And if you don't already track the number of documents you're translating or the number of LEP individuals served, by interpretation, you're going to have to determine the best way to do that reliably and consistently across your entire city, and across your entire, program. In many cases, you can write data collection requirements into contracts with external translation or interpretation vendors. That's kind of a pro tip that I would say as a vendor. Some of our clients do ask us to do that, and we do it as a courtesy, because why not, right? We have the data, it's collected, it's harvested. There's no reason not to share it to help our clients improve the quality of life of their LEP constituents. So, I recommend doing that because, then the vendor will work, with you, kind of as a partnership. And I think it is more of a relationship-based thing. And I really like when government and vendors can kind of collaborate to make things better. So definitely check with your vendors if they can share data with you if you're not already doing that. Just make sure that if you do that, though, that they're diligent and trustworthy, and ask them how they're collecting the data to make sure that it's good data. But if your agency or your government, relies largely on internal staff, right, like bilingual staff to provide interpretation and translation, you'll have to ask those staff members to keep track and report to you the services that they provide, right? So in terms of how often you collect data, in general, the greater the frequency, the better. For example, a weekly report gives you more opportunities to notice problems and identify their causes than a monthly report does. Our administrative assistant here at Global Wordsmiths was not billing one of our local school districts for the on-demand phone interpretation that they were using. And I didn't notice until I did a quarterly reconciliation of our books. And it was like a 5-figure figure, which for a small company is pretty crazy. So that was a lesson learned there. And I'm a data person, so I even missed that. So it's just a good reminder that collecting this data with frequency is really important. The school district was also pretty annoyed about getting an unexpected huge bill, right? So like things like that can have other unintended consequences also. Now, it's not just about collecting data, but it's using your measures to inform decisions, right? And that's the evaluation piece. Oops, advanced too soon again. So an important final step in kind of developing your assessment program or your evaluation strategy is kind of designing a method for using the data that you have collected, right? There are 2 steps to using your measures. First, you want to analyze the data. And second, you want to determine how you're going to use the results, right? So one way to kind of look at your measures is across programmatic areas, right? So in your case, maybe you can use measures to compare results in different linguistic communities within your city or geographical neighborhoods to each other. Can help you figure out where greater or fewer resources are being used, where they might be more or less effective. It can kind of tell those stories in a really compelling way. Another way to analyze your measures might be to look at them over time, right? So rather than looking at them comparatively, for like a 1-month period across neighborhoods, you can look at something, in which you need like a baseline or a starting point, because without some place to kind of call the beginning, you can't really tell if your services are increasing, staying the same, or decreasing, right? And so the first round of data you collect on your measures can kind of be considered your baseline. Second round of data can be compared to your first round. Third round can be compared to your first and second, and so on. And then you can notice trends over time, right? So whether it be looking at data across program areas or temporally or over time, as you get more data, you'll start to notice more trends, right? And that's why that data is so valuable to Google and to big tech companies and to translation companies who use CAT tools, right? Data is a real asset always, because the better you can tell these stories, the more resources you save, the more effective you can be. And so trends might go up, they might go down, they might be cyclical, but that means that they're kind of up during certain periods, like maybe the beginning of a school year or a calendar year, or they might be down during others, like summer vacation or holiday season. And that's all really valuable too, right? Because you can reliably predict, feast or famine sort of stuff, and reliably predict what your budget's going to be, and reliably predict which resources you're going to need to allocate where and at what time. So after you analyze or synthesize that, you want to interpret what the results mean, right? So look for, causes for any differences that you see, or if you see any discrepancies, you want to figure out why, and then you can kind of make appropriate decisions to alter your programming based on those results. So interpreting results can be difficult, and that's where evaluation comes in, right? So we're still talking about assessment at this point, and it's, before we move into evaluation of data, I want to share just on this slide here some examples of data collection tools that can be helpful in your assessment process. And I'm sure you guys have used these tools and that you think of them all the time, but hopefully maybe one of them will be new for you, or it can be helpful in some way. It's basically checklists, conferring within groups of peers, within the community of other language access folks, within the Welcoming America membership, within your own cities, identifying liaisons within each department of your city with whom you can request information, right? Language access liaisons who will report back to you. Having those liaisons return assessment tools similar to I think most of you have seen by now, the LAP.gov self-assessment tool, right? Whatever kind of self-assessment tool you're using, right? You can have those liaisons return them to you to assess your own needs and success. There is an assessment tool included in the resource packet that I shared with Anthony. Running records from targeted data collection points, such as recording language data at points of contact, for example, like when somebody walks in from the street and uses a language ID chart to tell you that they need a Swahili interpreter, right? Somehow capturing that, recording the number of requests that come in for each language and things like that. Anecdotal reports from community members and organizational liaisons. I think especially with regard to community members, it's really important to hear those voices and consider those voices. Rubrics, questionnaires, interviews, surveys, focus groups, right? Documents and records. And, this is pretty common practice, but bears repeating for the purposes of reminding you what these things are actually for. Because I know that as a person who is not a data scientist, I have this vague, awareness that, these are assessment tools, but I don't think about things from the perspective of a scientist or a data person, really, like a real data person, like a fake data person. So putting those in context and thinking about how you can use them to improve is something that I would also recommend taking some time to do. And part of what you'll need to figure out is kind of, where you're going to get your data, how to use tools like these to collect it, how to chase down data and figure some of that out. But the more systematized you can make it for people who are outside of your own language access circle, the better. And this kind of really gets at the problem of how do you get, somebody from Public Works or Parks and Rec to report back to you something that they don't care about at all, right? You make it really easy for them by giving them tools and checking in with them often. So that's kind of part of also this assessment part. The higher, or rather, the more data you can get, the higher quality it will be, your program will be. So it's better to get as many people on board as possible. And it's kind of everyone's responsibility to kind of constantly monitor and reevaluate, not just your collection methods, but also your data sources. There are some specific language access assessment tools that are in the resource packet that I shared that you can use. And as always, you can set up a time to talk to me if you need any help with that sort of thing, or if you just want a creative soundboard to kind of bounce ideas off of. I really enjoy that kind of stuff. So we're going to talk now about evaluation. You know, once you've kind of collected all of the data through assessment, you have to use it to tell a story, right? To identify those trends, to quantify the resources, you know, and demographics, to identify successes and failures, to provide an accurate overview of the work that you're doing, right? And I'm going to kind of briefly describe both qualitative and quantitative evaluation methods, just to give a few examples and just share a few resources. So basically, quantitative methods or quantitative data provide information that can be counted, right? To answer questions like how many, who was involved, what were the outcomes, how much did it cost? Quantitative data measure the depth and breadth of an implementation, right? So the number of people who requested interpreters, the number of complaints received. Quantitative data is usually collected before and after an evaluation period so that it can show outcomes and impact, right? And the big strength of quantitative data for the purposes of evaluation is that it can be easily generalized. So, you know, whether a sample represents a whole population, for example. They're easy to analyze, right? Because it's numbers, there's no subjectivity. They're consistent, they're precise if they're collected reliably. But then the limitations of using quantitative data for evaluation can include usually things like poor response rates from surveys, difficulty obtaining numbers, difficulties in valid measurements and things like that. Qualitative methods answer questions like, or qualitative data answers questions like, what is the value added, or who was responsible, or when did something happen, right? Qualitative data are collected through direct or subject observation, interviews, focus groups, case studies, reports, and things like that. And this is sort of information that you will collect during regular assessments as well. But analyzing qualitative assessment data might include more examination, research, comparing and contrasting, things like interpreting patterns, right? It's, you know, more subjective, less concrete. You know, analysis can include things like identifying themes, coding, clustering with similar data and information, reducing data to meaningful and important points, and you know, that's where the term data points comes from. But the strengths of quantitative data include providing contextual information to kind of explain complex issues, and you know, they complement quantitative data by explaining the why and the how behind the what, right? The limitations of qualitative data for evaluation could be the lack of the general, you know, like the ability to generalize it, the time consuming and sort of costly nature of the data collection itself, right? It's a lot harder to kind of pin down qualitative information, and then the difficulty and complexity of the analysis and interpretation process. So I am not a data scientist. It's, you know, I say I'm a fake data person because I love this stuff, but you know, I don't do math, and I, you know, I don't actually know a lot about data science. So I've kind of pared down and paraphrased a lot of information from various sources to sort of try to make it streamlined and digestible for you, to describe kind of qualitative and quantitative methodology, right? Those sources are included in that resource packet, and so you can do some of your own research on them. And you know, because this is such a short period of time, I do want to kind of just go through, a brief conclusion, and then we can talk about this and you guys can ask questions and share information with each other. So To conclude, with language access, I think it's easy to kind of fall into the trope of repeating the same inefficiencies over and over. So if you're doing the same things over and over again and it's not working, or you're spinning your wheels, or you're spending too much money without yielding the kind of outcomes that you want to see, stop and regroup and, be more deliberate about your assessments and evaluate those assessments regularly to tell the story of, why you're falling into those same traps, right? It's kind of like sending messages in a bottle, right? Rather than sending messages in a bottle, you want to create a deliberate strategy that identifies the intent of your efforts, the communities that you're engaging, why you're engaging them, what resources you have available to you in order to do all of those things. I think it's very easy for us to get very comfortable, for all people. It's not meant to be critical, just kind of staying with the way we have been doing things, right? But nothing is ever going to change in a meaningful way unless you kind of spend a lot of time up front, creating clear goals, laying out strategies for achieving them, and then, realistic and really good ways of measuring your success and collecting the information that you need to do that. So, in other words, and in closing, I think you all have a really good idea of what your aspirations are, right, for language access. But your next step, and I think, what needs to happen in the context of any policymaking, is to kind of lay out the things that you will have to accomplish in order to start doing that work and in order to do the work effectively. So that's the presentation. And I'd love to hear now about, going back to the beginning now. Do you guys have other answers now for that first question of, what is the intent of your strategy, right? What are some problems that you want to solve, like some specific measurable goals or problems that you want to solve through your language access programming, right? So who has answers now that may have been different from before, or did anybody think of anything that they can share with the group at this point? And also, do you guys have questions? So I see here, oh, this was from earlier. You guys were answering in the chat box and I didn't notice. I'm so sorry. So I'm going to read these. Earlier, when I asked the question about what are your goals and what is the intent of your programming, Adele Burke said to ensure that every resident can receive and understand emergency messages. That's really good. It's really specific. To be more equitable. I mean, obviously that's a wonderful goal. In this context though, Alejandra, I'd be really interested to know if your idea of how to get more specific about that has changed in the last 50 minutes. Easier access to city services, that's another one, whether or not, Austin, you have had, kind of any insight about how to get more specific and measurable about that. Alaric wrote, we are just at the beginning of our efforts. We're 40% foreign born in Redmond, Washington, and have a significant LEP population. Just getting basic information out and trying to create better access to city services. Okay, great. Annie Fenton, to create a consistent customer experience when accessing state of Michigan services. Removing existing postcode lottery, the reality of language access and access to multilingual staff, and to increase equitable access to services and resources, and notably when there are emergent issues, cooling and warming shelters, air shelters during heavy wildfire smoke, etc. So that's actually, in that last one, a really interesting shift from broad to specific, right? Where you want to increase equitable access to services and resources. That's a very broad goal. notably when there are emergent issues. Those are the more specific goals that you really want to define, so that you can have successful assessment and evaluation, right? Cooling and warming shelters, air shelters. Those are the things that you can collect quantitative and qualitative data about, right? Using deliberate assessment methods. So yeah, how have your thoughts about your answers at the beginning changed through the course of this presentation? I teach college students at 8 a.m., so I'm really good at the uncomfortable staying silent thing.
I have a quick question, Mary Jane. It's just
Yeah.
first going back to the qualitative versus quantitative. Is there a preference or a combination or ratio of how we should develop our outcomes to have a good mix of those?
So I think the answer to that question depends heavily on who you need to express the information to, right? If it's just internal for the purposes of continual improvement, then I don't think that there's like a great mix. I think it's whatever most effectively tells you the story that you need to hear. If you want to tell a story to a funder, then you might want to probably bump up the quantitative stuff, because quantitative stuff sort of tells a story about the kind of outputs that foundations and funders like to see. Outcomes are harder to express in a grant proposal, for example, right? But the numbers are something that speaks for themselves. But I think, the whole concept also of collecting and evaluating data over time will kind of answer those questions for you to see, what is working, what's not, and if you need to kind of adjust the way you collect information based on those issues.
Thanks.
Sure. Alejandra, you have your hand up.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you for this presentation. So I have a question that it could be large. It is,
Sure.
okay, so right now we're going to be budget discussions. Our team created dashboards to measure the tactics by language, by topic, by tactic. And we understand we are not assigning the same kind of weight to, for example, a text message that a PowerPoint presentation of 30 pages for HR or any kind of that. But this is the best effort that we can do. And if you guys have examples of other, that will be great as well. We also have been tracking training, how many internal training have we been doing, and etc. So in order for us to answer perhaps the question on how are we increasing language access, and how we can establish like the city to be a primary source for information for residents that have limited English, and have all equal access for everything. And this is an actual question that we have. I can answer and then tell them, okay, we have done, 1,000 translations since we launched the team in December, or we have done this training, or we have reached to these people. So, but because it's a budget discussion, what kind of suggestions do you have, if you have any at this moment, or anybody else from the team? Because we just want to tell, we have a great story, but just to limit to 3 bullet points that they wanted at this moment, and I have a very large and robust PowerPoint presentation, is what like, okay, I want that they see the impact so they can keep funding us. And we have it. We have the story, but just 3 bullet points, it's not the biggest, the bigger story. So if you have any recommendations at this moment, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I mean, I think there are a couple of different questions in there, and I think they're all good.
Okay.
And I love this format, and you know, this whole language access program that Welcoming America has done is so unique and so good because it does bring us all together. So I would love to hear, in response to Alejandra, like if you all have answers to the first part of her question about what's worked, and if you have other methods or methodologies to suggest. And then I'm sure you also all have other insight into like, how do you tell the story most effectively? And what I would say to that, I mean, there are a lot of things I can say to that, but I actually spoke to a pretty big funder on the West Coast yesterday who's interested in funding language access work. And one of the things he explained to me is just that, you know, when you have 100 grantees in a category as, you know, a private foundation, you don't want to read, you know, 300 really long applications. And I know that sounds horrible, but the more skilled you can become at synthesizing the most information into the fewest words, the better. And so the whole 3 bullet point thing, I agree, it's tough because, you know, when you're proud of your accomplishments, you want to share those. But I would say it's all about knowing what the audience wants to hear and prioritizing that information, and then doing it in a way that's very compelling and plays up the outcomes while also conveying the quantifiable outputs, if that makes any sense. But I'm going to let others weigh in also. So please, what do you all think about that? So Alejandra, what kind of specific resources were you hoping to get from the group in terms of, I think I forgot the first part of the question, which was just, you were asking about like what methods have worked for everybody. Can you rephrase that question for the group?
For example, okay, I put together this dashboard that so I said, okay, we're counting daily. We're doing 20 translations. 5 translations are COVID related, 5 are regular, or 5 are Spanish, 10 are Chinese, or these are flyers, these are door hangers, and all those kind of things. So, but you cannot wait the same. It's not, it's like, okay, it's not the same effort, or it's not the same to do one text message. Is not comparable to a PowerPoint presentation, on a training presentation, on an audio script for that. So if you are working sometimes in other areas like advertising agencies or in marketing, sometimes you give some weight to that. Okay, a PowerPoint presentation will cost, for example, 5 points versus a text message will be 1 point. I'm not doing that like that. I'm counting just each translation project is one result.
Like one data point.
Yeah, one data point. Yeah. I'm not giving any things because we're just creating this and without nobody have done this in the city of Dallas. So we are the first one doing that. So so my question is, and I asked the Dallas School District, they didn't have an answer either. They say the same. We're counting one by one. If you guys, you have any other additional inputs on that, or are you counting in the same way? I'm not saying that it's right or wrong. It's just like when I explain it and I provide this information to our chief, where we keep telling, okay, please remember, it's not the same to do a text message or to do a graphic that to create or to translate a PowerPoint presentation of 40 pages of equity or economic development in Chinese, Vietnamese, and Spanish to all these people.
Right.
But if
yeah.
nobody have anything different, that's fine as well. I mean, I think we are all, there is no right or wrong question. It's just, I'm just trying to convey on what are the different efforts that everybody's doing.
Yeah, and I think that I think the assessment tools and the assessment methods are a good starting point there. And then in the resources that I shared with Anthony, there's also the CDC one about community health assessment. It's not the same as language access, but it's really targeted, and a lot of the problems of accessibility are similar. And so there's some great information in there that might help you answer that question also. And for now, if anybody does have anything to add or to answer, please go ahead. I did just notice that it's 1:58 and I want to keep you guys on schedule. So we'll probably wrap up here shortly, but Alejandra, I think that was a great question. And it just highlights how important it is to be deliberate about assessment, right? So like whatever the answer is, whatever's worked for everybody is important, but also important just to be thinking about this and to be strategic so that you're collecting good information that you can actually use, right?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And we're coming up right about at 2 o'clock on the nose here. So thank you guys as always. And thanks again for being flexible with last week's scheduling snafu. Thank you, Anthony, as always, for being awesome and providing the tech support. And I'll turn it over to you now in case you have any closing remarks.
Yep. Just really quickly, I know some of you came in a little bit after Mary Jane mentioned the resources. So I confirmed I've got them in my inbox. So when I put together the follow-up from today, which will contain the recording, I'll also make sure that those resources are shared with you as well. So look for an email on that. And then I'll also add them into the member forum so you can access them down the road if you need to revisit all the info there. All right, so really quickly, and I should have pulled this before, but our next call is coming up on August the 11th. And Mary Jane, correct me if I'm wrong, but I've got noted the topic will be choosing and contracting language service providers. I think we're good.
Yeah, that is correct.
Excellent. All right. Well, if anyone has any questions, reach out to me, let me know. Otherwise, have a great rest of your week and we'll see you next month. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.